كده بدأت أنا مسكر.
اوكي. مساء من الدوحة. اسمي مهران كامرافا، وأنا رئيس وحدة الدراسات الإيرانية في المركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات. واحدة من أهم العلاقات في الشرق الأوسط هي العلاقات بين إيران ومصر، فهذان هما من أكبر وأقدم الاقتصادات في المنطقة ومن أهم اللاعبين الدبلوماسيين في الشرق الأوسط. ومنذ العام 78-79 مر البلدان بأكثر علاقات توترا فيما بينهما. وفي الحقيقة فيما يتعلق بالمنطقة يمكن اعتبار مصر وإيران قوتين عظيمتين، لكنهما كانتا
helping us better navigate and understand this incredibly complex relationship is Dr. Ahmed Morsy. Dr. Ahmed Morsy holds a PhD in international relations from St. Andrews University, and he did his research on Egyptian foreign policy in relation to Iran. Ahmed's works have been published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Middle East Institute, and the Rafi Hariri Center for the Middle East. Currently, Dr. Morsy is the manager of the Middle East and North Africa program at the American Political Science Association, and he is also the co-founder of the Arab Political Science Network. I should mention that the first time I met Dr. Morsy was in Tehran, where we were both doing research. So it is wonderful to see him again, although virtually. He has been a terrific scholar, and I'm delighted and honored to have him with us. Dr. Morsy will speak for about 30 minutes and has kindly agreed to.
الدكتور مرسي سيتحدث أولا في
an icon at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation, and if you'd like to listen to the talk in Arabic, you can click on the Spanish icon. So without further ado, my good friend Ahmed Morsy, go ahead please.
Thank you, Mehran. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the Center for the invitation. It's indeed has been a long time since we have met in person, not just our first time in Tehran, but also the recent times we met during other conferences that we have been part of. And today's topic is very close to my heart since it was my PhD dissertation. It's research that I've been interested in for a long time. And if you would allow me, I prepared a short presentation that would go along with some of the points that I would like to talk about in our conversation today. I'm not sure if I will go up to 30 minutes. I would really appreciate if we can possibly have more questions from our colleagues in the audience that are watching us, and I look forward to that. So if you give me a second, I can share my screen and we can start. I hope everyone can see this. So today's topic is about Egypt-Iran relation, and the presentation will look at this zigzag politics, as I term it in my dissertation and my research, about how the relationship has went through a lot of different changes through the time, ebbs and flows between different leaders, between different regional changes, international powers as well. And I hope to be able to answer some of these questions and guide you through those points. The talk will basically look at these three main elements. So why I got interested in how in looking at the relationship between Egypt and Iran, some history and overview of the relations across the different presidencies and the monarchies at the beginning of the time. And then possibly towards the end, we can end with like what's next, what's going to happen as we see changes in the regional order in the region. So let me start by talking a little bit about how and why I got interested in Iran. I think the first time I realized that the Shah of Iran was buried in Egypt was towards the late 90s during a visit to a Rifa'i mosque in Old Cairo near the Citadel. And it was a surprise for me because I didn't know about that. During my time in school and other conversations, Israel was more prominent, the Palestinian cause was more prominent. This type of history was more clearer and understood more than any history about the relationship with Iran. And this triggered me to start reading. And later in my master's dissertation at the American University in Cairo, and later at St. Andrews when I did my PhD, I decided to look at Iran and its role because it was very important to kind of address some of the discrepancies in some of the narratives, and also double check some of the reasons why some of those big powers kind of align at times or go and be more of like at enmity at other times. So what do Egypt and Iran have in common? This is a quote from a piece by David Ignatius back in September 2016, at a time when both Presidents Sisi and was speaking at the United Nations General Assembly in the September meetings. And at the time, there were these sideline meetings with some of the press. And as you can see the quote, and it says, and it highlights some of the main schisms like the Sunni Shia representation of both Egypt and Iran. But at the same time, it looks at some of the areas where both of them have common challenges or common areas where both of them are looking at, like domestic and security stability, economic growth, younger population, how both of them are very proud ancient cultures, and they look at the role very differently than other countries in the region. And I think this highlighted some of the areas and points that I have also came across during my research, my conversations and interviews in both Cairo and Tehran. And it will come up in our also other slides and other points as we move along. So what factors diverge Egypt and Iran? And these are four general points or factors that have been highlighted through different research, not just mine, of course. There have been other people who have looked at this type of divergence. And I would like to highlight two of them specifically, which is the personality politics and the leaders' threat perceptions, and how this is something that have played an important role in the narratives that both leaders, both nations have put out there towards each other in both times, at times of enmity and at times of friendliness. There is another component, which is the domestic political and economic considerations. And I think this comes at play, especially at times when both countries go through domestic upheavals and domestic changes, whether this is from a revolution and uprising, whether this is a change in leadership, and it adds another layer that could help us understand why they, again, at times come together, and other times they might be apart. The two last items, the regional and external alliances, as well as the competing visions for regional order, kind of go hand in hand to an extent, and also come back to the main point, which is the personality politics that come to play in terms of the relationship between these two nations. And we can briefly and simply say that at times, I would say even most of the time, both countries have been at the opposite side of regional order and regional dynamics, and they have different views of how to maybe build that type of regional order and what comes before the other. So I will go through the early phases quickly about the relationship between both Egypt and Iran. And as I said, it starts with Reza Shah coming to power in 1925, while at the same time we have King Fuad of Egypt, who was the king at the time. And in 1928, both countries signed the Iranian-Egyptian Treaty, which was a treaty that was signed in November 28, 1928. And it was a treaty that focused and looked at diplomatic relations and the rights of citizens of each country while they are residing in both Iran and Egypt. This was an interesting development because a couple of years earlier, Egypt gained independence in 1922 from Britain, while the Brits were still there in Egypt in terms of diplomatic, civilian leadership, and also military. But Egypt had some more space to start conducting foreign relations on its own. And this Iranian-Egyptian treaty was one of the early treaties that Egypt signed with foreign countries. However, the relationship is older than that. And of course, it goes back to very, very long time ago during Egyptian pharaohs and Persian kings. But briefly, towards the second half of the 19th century, with the growing of Cairo and Alexandria to become more cosmopolitan, have brought in a lot of people from different countries and ethnicities and backgrounds. The Iranians were there. There is an interesting magazine that was being published, a community magazine in Egypt, was published by the Iranian community. It's called Shehri Nima, that ran between day-to-day life of the Iranians. It looked at their businesses, their relationship with Egypt and the Egyptians, and so on and so forth. And it highlighted some of the main businesses that the Iranians were engaged in, like, again, the famous rug business, tobacco, and other spices that they used to bring from the East. And at the time, that was India and other Asian countries. Even at the time, the magazine highlighted the fact that a lot of business owners and shops in the famous Khan al-Khalili neighborhood and market in Old Cairo was owned or ran by Iranians. And that was an interesting discovery, and looking into the dynamics of the relationship between most of those Iranians who have been residing in Egypt, benefiting from business opportunities and other advancement that was not at the time available in Iran, and as well as the development that the community went through in terms of using Arabic, assimilation, and mixed marriages, as we will see with the marriage, for instance, of the Shah, the new Shah, and Princess Fawzia of Egypt. Another also individual or someone who would feature later, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was married to his wife, Tahiyya, was from Iranian origin. So that was also another interesting development at the time. So as I was talking, the development of the relations between both countries went through the next phase, which is further development in the 30s of more trade and economic agreements. And in 1939, it was culminated by the marriage of Muhammad Reza, the Crown Prince of Iran, and Princess Fawzia, the daughter of King Fuad and the sister of King Farouk, the young king of Egypt. This marriage was interesting because at the time, Iran was also looking at consolidating, or Reza Shah was looking at consolidating further his rule in Iran. As we know, most of the monarchies around the world have usually their sons and daughters marry from other monarchies and other ruling families. The other established ruling family in the region was Egypt. And this marriage kind of brought together the different ideas that both sides were interested in. So one, as I mentioned, that Iran was trying to build further relations and consolidate power internally. Also in Egypt, this marriage offered an opportunity for the young king Farouk to further solidify and show that he is also a leader in the Islamic world, not just within the Arab world. As we know, the Ottoman Empire had already fallen after World War I, And some members of the Egyptian sheikhs and clergy in Al-Azhar tried to convince or spoke to the king that maybe he should use his leadership and power and possibly revive this Ottoman rule, but under Egyptian rule, and Egypt would be the leader of the Islamic world. And at the time, actually, two, um, two, two short stories or quick ones. Um, when the marriage was about to happen, Al-Azhar had to issue a fatwa that says that it's okay and it's permissible that the Sunni princess, because Egypt is mostly Sunni, can marry a Shia leader or individual. And that was something that Al-Azhar never had to deal with before or think about before, even though Al-Azhar was, as some of you might know, was created and constructed by the Fatimites, which is a Shiite dynasty that ruled Egypt for around 200 years. But Al-Azhar didn't have to deal with this before, or didn't have to think about it. And number two, there were no Farsi speakers in the institution. And they had to conduct most of the conversations and arrangements either with those who can speak Arabic from the team of the Crown Prince, or in French, which was mostly the language of the educated at the time around the region in Egypt as well. So these were like two small things that came up at the time. Moving forward from that time to the 1940s and 50s. These were also very interesting times because both countries were going through a lot of nationalist fervor, anti-British, anti-colonial kind of rhetoric, especially after World War II, and the movement for independence from most of the colonial powers in the region. And in 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh became the Prime Minister of Iran. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that had concessions that would run Iran's oil until 1993. This created a big spillover around the world and a big challenge for the British power and rule, not just in Iran, but also in other places in the region. Egypt was going through its own also challenges at the time. If I remember correctly, during that time, there were continued kind of fighting during the around the canal area, the Suez Canal area in Egypt, between some of the British troops and some of the Egyptian policemen and civilians who were kind of going through an uprising against the British. And it led to the infamous moment of in 1952 on January 25th, which is the police day in Egypt, and later becomes another symbol for revolution in Egypt in 2011. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh decides to stop by Egypt on his way back from the United States after a 6-week visit to speak at the League of Nations and at the United Nations, and to meet with the US administration. As you can see from this video, it shows the huge crowds that came out to meet Mossadegh, that even had Arabic, French, and Farsi banners calling for long live Mossadegh, long live Iran. There have been a lot of also newspaper coverage, as this clipping from Al-Ahram that talks about the meetings in Cairo with Mustafa Nahas, who is the Prime Minister of Egypt, the potential and possible collaborations against the British rule and for independence, also reaffirming the Iranian-Egyptian Treaty from 1928 and developing other articles and components that could develop the relationship between both countries. It's also important to note that at the time, while I mentioned that Mossadegh nationalized the oil company, in just a month before his visit, so in October of 51, Egypt abrogated a 1936 treaty with Britain and decided to kind of use that as a leverage to kind of try to negotiate or attempt at developing a different relationship with Britain and end the British occupation and presence, especially around the canal and the Suez Canal area. Moving on, just 2 years later, actually, if Mossadegh was in Cairo in November 1951, in July 52, this was an important moment in both countries. At the time, during that summer in Iran, Mossadegh was in very, very heated negotiations with Mohammad Reza Shah, who became the Shah after his father was deposed by the British and Russian forces in 1941. And Mossadegh was trying to push for kind of a constitutional monarchy, where the prime minister basically have the powers and the Shah is slowly becoming a symbolic figure of the nation. And at the time, the argument was going about the responsibility and power of the prime minister to appoint the Minister of War or Minister of Defense, and other powers related to finances and economic measures, especially after the nationalization of the oil company. In July 52, Nasser and several fellow officers in the Egyptian army moved to depose the King Farouk, and later in 53 announced the Republic of Egypt. But at the time, these were overlapping moments that were interesting because it begs a lot of questions if these two countries were actually at the time having close relations and what both might have done if Mossadegh had stayed in power beyond 1953 and overlapped with Nasser for a much longer time, and how would this relationship would have ensued and looked. And it goes back to my first point, and as I started earlier in the conversation, that personality politics and the perception of the leadership matters in this relationship. In 53, as some of you know, Mossadegh was removed by a coup that was orchestrated by the British and American intelligence, and reinstalled the Shah again as the ruler of Iran. That later on in interviews and in different clippings that I came across during my research was very prominent in how Nasser and some of the people around him have viewed the Shah and how he came back to the throne using the imperial powers. And as you know, Nasser's rhetoric at the time was anti-imperial, anti-colonial, pro-independence, no to pacts, especially security pacts. And Iran at the time was a member of the Baghdad Pact. Nasser was trying to also finish or end the presence of the British troops, and in 1954 signed this treaty with Britain that by June 56 the British forces had left. So a lot of things were going on in Egypt that didn't necessarily make it a priority for Nasser to look at building any relationships with Iran, especially as I mentioned, both sides were sitting on polar opposite of each other. This continued back and forth, and especially during the 1960s, where both sides were blaming each other, using their propaganda machines, and especially Nasser's propaganda machine through the radio waves and TV and print media, in denouncing the Shah and using him as a bad example in an attempt to ask and push the Arab countries and monarchies to join him in his Arab nationalist approaches and policies. It's also important to note that in 1960, in July, around the same time, I believe in 24th of July, 1960, the Shah in a statement announced that Iran recognizes the state of Israel. This wasn't a new information, but it was the first time that it was publicly announced in the open. Iran had previously, during the 1950-1951, had an emissary who was based in Israel, in Tel Aviv at the time. And in 1951, Mossadegh, I believe in the summer, as part of the reform and reorganization that he was overseeing, recalled the Iranian ambassador using the pretext of financial reasons, that the budget does not allow for extending Iranian emissaries in different countries. And according to some of the memoirs that were written about Mossadegh, he believed that that was a move that would appease some of the Arab and Muslim countries and would make Iran look like better and build a better relationships with these Arab countries. So in 1960, when the Shah announced that, Nasser took it more personal and decided to cut relations with Iran completely, and continued until 1970 actually, to have this bitter relationship with Iran. And just a month before his death in 1970, relations were resumed between Egypt and Iran. And when Nasser died, Iran actually mourned his death for 3 days as a symbol, as a gesture for a renewed potential relationship that would come next. Moving on to the main, I would say, the main individual, the main character and leader who have built this or made and showed how both countries could come together in a setup that could be beneficial for both of them. And apologies on the video, but hopefully it works now. Sadat have developed a very, very close personal relationship with the Shah. They first met in 1969 during a conference in Rabat of the Islamic countries. And at the time, it seemed that both leaders left a very good impression on each other, even though the Shah was had very strong words to say about Egypt and the adventurous politics that Nasser was pursuing prior to 1967 war with Israel, and that led to to Egypt's defeat and loss of its land. During the 70s, Sadat thought that building a relationship with the Shah would be beneficial for different reasons. One, Iran has very close relationship with the United States. It has a relationship, not of course as close, but a very good relations with Israel that has been developing during the 1960s. The Sadat was interested in regaining the land that was lost in 1967, the Sinai Peninsula, and preparations had already started under Nasser for potential war to regain the land. And Sadat thought that trying to build more alliances and more countries that would help him develop better relations with the West and possibly have a conversation with the Israelis when needed, that would be ideal for Egypt. Another reason was the financial component. So Egypt was a much poorer country, poorer economy, reeling from the war with Israel in '67, attrition war later on, and was trying to find ways to build a better economic setup. And with Iran's financial debt and money from oil, specifically during the 1970s, after the oil crisis of '73, Sadat thought to tap into that as well by proposing different agreements, different bilateral and measures and companies and projects, and so on and so forth. So these were among the main areas where both sides kind of found interest in working together. As you can see from these clippings from Al-Ahram from 1975, at the top, during a 5-day visit by the Shah and his wife to Egypt. And then from 1976 at the bottom, when Sadat visited Iran and had this also 5-day trip that involved visiting different cities around Iran and meeting and attending even a military training with the Shah. It's also important to note that Iran hosted and took some of the Egyptian soldiers who were injured during the 1973 war to be treated in Iran. And maybe towards the end of this video, you might see Vice President at the time, Hosni Mubarak, who was visiting some of those injured.
Ahmed, I'm so sorry. We can't see the video, just
Oh.
for your information.
Sorry, let me. You would think that technology by now we would have mastered it, but I guess it's not working as we would like it to.
Not to worry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So maybe I would just skip through it if it's working now, hopefully. Anyways, so just as we were saying that Sadat and the Shah developed this close relationship that allowed for developing closer ties between Egypt and Iran. Also, it was interesting because at the time Sadat was developing closer relations with other Arab countries, especially after the war of 1973 and after regaining the land and starting a peace process with Israel. Of course, again, 2 quick notes about this. During the late 1970s, and with reopening or attempts to reopen the canal, the Suez Canal in 1976, Iran helped a lot financially in clearing the waterway and rebuilding and reconstructing some of the Suez Canal cities, specifically Port Said. And at the time, Iran was deemed like the number 3, I think, in terms of foreign currency, foreign investors, or countries that loaned Egypt and granted Egypt financial support after Saudi and Kuwait. I think the estimates were around $600 or $650 million at the time. Towards the end of the 70s, in 1979, while Egypt was finishing its peace treaty with Israel and the negotiations with Israel, the revolution in Iran erupted in 1979 and led to the deposing the Shah. And the first stop for the Shah in January 16, 1979 was to Egypt, where he visited Egypt and stayed for a couple of days before moving on to the Bahamas, Morocco, Mexico, and the United States, where he was being treated from cancer. The Shah would later come back in March 1980 for further treatments and staying in Egypt until his death in the summer. And because of the close and personal relationship between Sadat and the Shah, Sadat insisted on doing a full like funeral that's worthy of a leader of another country, especially someone who is as close to Egypt and to Sadat personally. Seems like my screens are okay. All right. So that, of course, made the Iranians very upset, and specifically Ayatollah Khomeini, who led Iran and announcing the Islamic Republic of Iran in April 1979. He also announced cutting the relations just a month after Egypt and Israel signed their peace treaty. Iran's revolution and its Islamic fervor specifically, and created a lot and prompted a lot of changes across the region. And at that time, it's okay. I'm not sure, Mehran, if my screen stopped sharing, but it seems like it did.
Yes, it is. Your screen is not shared, and we can't see your PowerPoint, just for your information.
Yeah, I think there is, I don't know what's the, can you see this now?
No, just you have, it's a blank screen. You are showing your screen, but there's no PowerPoint.
Well, it seems like my PowerPoint stopped. So anyways, I will continue with the PowerPoint until we can figure, if I can figure this and fix it. So as I was saying, the Iranian Revolution came about with a lot of changes across the region. Islamists in different countries around the region started to take notice and be interested in possibly emulating Iran in its Islamic movement. This is not a surprise. There have been a lot of a lot of countries across the region that had small and supporters of an Islamic version of leadership and Islamic State. And I think Iran's revolution prompted some of that to come about. And in Egypt specifically, this was very evident and clear in 1981 when members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad assassinated President Sadat in 1981 in October. And moving forward with that, Mubarak's reign has been termed as a normalized stagnation relationship. And the reason I'm saying that is because Mubarak's character and personality and interest in running and ruling Egypt has been much more different than his predecessors, whether Sadat or Nasser. He was less keeping the ship afloat and continuing to move forward. And that meant inability to also deal with an activist Iranian regime. And the Islamic Revolution have basically, as if you have put someone who's completely different to lead the country. Like when Nasser came to power, he represented this bigger shift in relationship and in politics that public. Mubarak's reign across the 30 years can be seen also through these different moments of ebb and flow in the relationship. So towards the early 90s, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and as we know, Iran and Iraq fought bitterly for 8 years during the 80s. Iran was supportive or generally in agreement relations between the Arab Gulf monarchies and Iran. Under President Rafsanjani, more development have happened, better relations economically, diplomatically, and trade have started to develop. Egypt took notice, it elevated and started running, both countries started running interest sections at each other's capital, and later elevated the leader or the presence of that section to be headed by an ambassador. Even though it's not a full functioning embassy, but it acts as a consular service, and it has some representation for cultural also engagement. In 2003, there was this famous moment and famous photo that I wish I can share with you. This during a summit in Geneva, I think the World Technology Summit, Mubarak and President Khatami met on the sidelines. And that was the first time an Egyptian and Iranian president meets since the Shah was in Egypt in 1979. And actually the last visit of an Egyptian leader to Iran was in 1978 by Vice President Hosni Mubarak. During the 2000s, more meetings developed.
Ahmed, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I think you're frozen. We're not necessarily being able to see you here.
Can you hear me at least?
We hear you, yeah, but
okay.
we can't see you.
Well, I guess. Well, let me. Okay. Well, I
would it help if you turn off your camera and turn it on again?
Let me try. Actually, for some reason, I'm unable to. It seems like the Zoom platform itself kind of became
the well, these are some of the challenges of the COVID era. So go ahead. Your voice is quite pleasant.
Thank you. So my apologies for everyone. So I'll try to wrap this up then, and then maybe that would be an opportunity to have more questions and we have a conversation, since we already went beyond the time that we allocated. So just with the fall of Mubarak in 2011, ascendance of Mohammed Morsy to the presidency in 2012, there was a potential renewed rapprochement that was short-lived within the couple of months of August to June of 2013. So from August 2012 to when Mohammed Morsi visited Iran, which was the first, again, high-level first visit ever by an Egyptian president since the 70s, and then followed up a visit by Ahmadinejad in 2013 for the Organization of Islamic Conference. At the time, there were renewed questions of possible and potential relationship that would come back between both countries, that both sides would be able to overcome the differences. But with the deposing of Morsi in 2013, I think we went back to square one and a more stagnant, normalized stagnation that was under Mubarak. To what extent and what comes next, I think that would be or could be part of our conversation and some of the questions. And apologies again for all these technical difficulties. And I look forward to continue the conversation with all of you now. Thank you, Mehran.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. If I could, this was terrific. I'm really grateful. And this is something that I currently happen to be working on, the diplomatic history of Iran. And I learned a great deal myself. If I could ask you to log out of Zoom and log back in, sure. Probably that might help us. One of the things I just wanted to mention, as Ahmed is going to join us, is when Fawzia married the former Shah of Iran, she was quite unhappy in Iran and thought of Iran as very underdeveloped as compared to Cairo. Tehran at that time was still considered a small town compared to Cairo. And just as Al-Azhar had to issue a fatwa saying she could marry a Shia man, the Iranian constitution had to be reinterpreted to allow for the wedding, so that she could have been the mother of the next heir. Ahmed, welcome back.
Thank you.
We can see you now. I was just mentioning that Queen Fawzia was quite unhappy in Iran during the brief marriage, and just as Al-Azhar had to issue a fatwa blessing the marriage in Iran, the constitution had to be reinterpreted to allow for a non-Iranian mother to the heir to the throne, which didn't come to pass anyway. But listen, thank you so much for that conversation. If our audiences have questions, they can ask the questions either directly through Zoom or through our social media platforms, and I will convey them to our guest, Dr. Morsy. Ahmed, if I could ask a question, one of the sources of tension between Iran and Egypt has long been this symbolic politics that Iran engages in, particularly the naming of a street in Tehran after the assassin of President Sadat. There's the Khaled Istanbuli street in Tehran. What's the status of that? Have they gotten rid of that, or is it still there?
Funny that you ask, actually. So I don't know if you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can. Yes.
So I'm not going to expand it. I'll just leave it as a small slide, but hopefully you can all see it. So that was the last screen that I had, or last slide. And basically, it had 3 photos that I took while on my trip to Iran. One for one of the murals that still is there for Khaled Istanbuli. And it says, Man Pharaon Ma Misr Rakishtam, which is I killed the Pharaoh of Egypt. And it has the top photo is the old Egyptian embassy in Tehran, which is I think now is a ceramics and tile museum. And then this is like the small one is the Egyptian resident, the Egyptian ambassador's residency in Tehran. So yes, the short answer is both. That street is still there and the murals are there. And it has been always a political issue for Egypt. And the argument have always been from the different interviews that I have done, the argument has always been Egypt wants to normalize with Iran based on security arrangements first, or security agreements first. Iran wants to normalize based on political understanding and agreements first. And we can understand why both sides would want to do that. Egypt was concerned under Mubarak, specifically with, again, growing Islamic sentiments, Al-Qaeda, other members of the Egyptian nationals who have been joining some of the extremist groups. So that was important. Iran was a country that was isolated, going through different versions of back and forth to the international community, and again, an acceptance and developing relations with Egypt would be something of a win for the Iranian regime that they would need. So that continued to be an issue. And just also to be to show that the Iranians, for them as well, the burial of the Shah in Egypt until today was another sour point and area. So whenever Egypt raised the Istanbuli street and the murals, the Iranians would raise the Shah's burial ground in Egypt. So that has been some of the back and forth on these tiny, small things.
Right, thank you. Ahmed, I don't know if you've been to Doha, but one of the pleasures of working here and living here is that you're surrounded with a number of really good individuals who also happen to be brilliant scholars. One of them is my colleague and friend Khalil Al-Anani, who has a question. Khalil?
Oh, thank you very much, Mehran. Let me first congratulate you for launching this unit. It's a little bit late, but I'm so happy to see you there. Also, thank Ahmed, my friend Ahmed, for this excellent presentation. I'm really sorry for the glitch that happened that affected the flow of your talk. But these things happen always. I'm really happy to see this kind of archival and historical relationship, Ahmed. I'm really happy to see an Egyptian scholar working on this. We don't have many Egyptian scholars who are covering this important issue. I have a couple of questions, if you allow me, you and Mehran allow me. The first one is, honestly, until now, I don't understand why Egypt and Iran didn't develop strong relationship over the last 3 or 4 decades. I don't think this the issue of Khaled Istanbuli street or the burial of Shah in Egypt is really the issue. For me, it's a tribal issue, honestly. I mean, you are talking about 2 of the key regional forces that couldn't come together for the last 4 decades. For why? Is it only this kind of tribal issues or something else? This is the first point. Second point, which is very ironic to me, honestly, that the relationship between Iran and Egypt, can it be linked to the Egyptian-American alliance that has been there for 4 decades now, since 1979 until now, or not? Or also, is it linked to the Gulf Egyptian alliance, which also might affect on the Egyptian perspective towards Iran? Because for me, even Egypt could not or did not actually try to use this leverage of building a relationship with Iran in order to, let's say, to play this card with either the US or the Gulf, but they never did that. This is out of stability, lack of vision, or why? Particularly when it comes to negotiating with the US, because US is very antagonistic to Iran for different reasons. So I never understood why Egypt didn't play this card, trying even to blackmail the US by extending the relationship with Iran. If you just could highlight these issues, that would be great. And thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you, Khalil. So thank you, Khalil, and good to see you. So this is, I think, the $1 million question that anyone should be trying to answer. And in my dissertation, basically, you mentioned two things. The relationship, so how trivial is this, the point of Islamboli versus the Shah's burial? And I think this is, yes, it's a trivial issue. And I think it's just used when both countries or both sides want to just show that, okay, we can't move beyond that. But I think there are two things that through the research I can kind of look at and attest to. One is this leadership perception component. And again, this is more of like me, the academic, the political science IR person who's coming to talk. And I think the leader perception here is very important, because if you looked at the tone, the language that's being used by both sides during the leadership on both sides, you can see how they are actually perceiving each other. So Nasser came at a time where he was seeing anti-colonial is his main language, pro-independence, and the Shah represented the antithesis of this. At the same time, of course, Nasser represented the opposite of what the Shah wanted. He was insecure. He came back with a coup, and even I think knowing how Nasser uses his language and oratory power, he even called him, he has a Musaddiq syndrome. It's like it was very, very like that. That language was a tool to showcase these kind of differences. So there is a perception from the leaders that gets to develop either by the leaders' understanding of the regional affairs, of the country's affairs, or also the security establishment. And I think this was very clear during Mubarak's time. The security establishment, whether it's domestic or intelligence, have put a lot of emphasis on Shiism and support for Islamic groups. Yes, Iran I believe, is a pragmatic state. It's a country that worked with Sunnis and Shiites and non-denominations whatsoever to advance its interests that we can disagree with. That's completely fine. But to only look at it from one angle, just to focus on it in a perspective that Iran, if we opened relations with them, there would be more Shiites in Egypt, or we are not going to get anything out of the Gulf. Like this zero-sum approach was, I think, how the security services have managed to maintain this anti-Iran kind of rhetoric. Also, not just that, but also Mubarak was not, as I mentioned towards the end, and I'm sorry I had to abruptly finish this, but Mubarak was not interested in any activist approaches and changes in relationships. He knew certain things very well. He managed to revive certain relations during his first 10 years and later on with Western countries. But Iran was not, again, on that much on the interest. He used it though, and to be clear, he used it when he wanted to get leverage from the Gulf. Like he would issue a statement, he would meet with a high official, Ali Larijani coming to Egypt, Shahar Muttaqi coming to Egypt, using sometimes during the 90s even Amr Moussa as a very smart activist foreign minister who is always trying to create opportunities for rapprochement or conversations. So again, to just come back to answer this, it's the leadership perception and it's the personality of that leader, and then the regional dynamics that affect kind of the relationship. And of course, there are moments of domestic upheaval that push you to kind of rethink some of these conversations again.
Thank you, Ahmed. Another colleague from the Doha Institute, Dr. Abdul Fattah Mahdi, has a similar question. And I will also add to Dr. Mahdi's question. Dr. Mahdi asks, given Iran's regional behavior, its influence in Iraq, its tensions with the UAE, its actions in Syria, given your expertise, how do you think Iran and Egypt could deal with these issues and move forward? And then related to this, I will add, to what extent, given current circumstances right now, is Egypt an independent actor when it comes to relations with Iran, considering its robust relations with Saudi Arabia?
So these are very good questions. I think one of the other main questions and that I try to answer through my research is that why and how countries like UAE, Qatar, even Saudi Arabia at times had very warm relationship. I mean, UAE specifically through Dubai and the trade, the daily flights and economic investments has been an interesting anomaly in that sense, because it continues to use the language of Iran controlling the 3 islands. So politically, we have an issue and it's territorial, but at the same time, on the trade and economic component, they are very, very strong. Of course, in the past couple of years, especially under the Trump administration, most of the UAE have tried to push or curtail some of this relationship, economic relationship with Iran for sanctions reasons and other reasons. But now I think one element that Egypt and Iran agrees on, and it goes back to the first quote from David Ignatius' piece, is that the regional stability and security. They might have a different view of how to come about to this, but they actually agree that regional stability and security is important. A country's sovereignty is important, even though, of course, we might understand this differently because Iran has presence and proxies in multiple countries. But both of them agree on the concept that we should have a better setup in the region that maintain a regional security. And to that point, I mean, I would like to say 2 things. One is that I don't see an Egyptian-Iranian relations going bilateral on its own away from the Gulf countries. And not because Egypt's relations with the Gulf is a dependent relation or economic dependent only, but also because I think that's the only way Iran will be willing to deal with this situation. If Egypt, Saudi, maybe another country kind of come together and like decide this is our plan for a better relation, for a peaceful relation, a security understanding, and it could start with more of a security understanding, then that could be an approach. But I don't see necessarily Egypt and Iran having this two-way relations away from what's going on in the region. Another thing that is actually going to be interesting to see moving forward is Egypt's renewed engagement with Iraq and Jordan. This recent deal of reconstruction for oil and supporting the Iraqi government for building and expanding and all of that stuff is going to be interesting because Iran and Turkey, which are very, very big countries in the region, have important presence in Iraq. whether through militias and support militarily, whether it's within the Iraqi government, whether through business and trade and economy at large. And for Egypt to come into that market, even with an agreement with the Iraqi government, it has to be prepared to deal with some of the Iranian proxies, whether again, they are business related or political related. And if Egypt is not willing and ready to engage on that level, then I think it will have a hard time containing or moving forward with this kind of deal. And I think it's important also for Egypt to realize that there is politics in everything, and it's not a deal that's going to be signed by the Egyptian government and the Iraqi government, and some companies are going to go to work. There is politics involved, and it means that Egypt has to be prepared again to deal with other players in Iraq.
Thank you. We have a colleague from the Arab Center, Mr. Saif. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mehran, and thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for having this great presentation. I've enjoyed it a lot. I might take you back to the post-revolution era, the post-revolution time of 2100, January Revolution. The representative of the Iranian affairs, he appeared so much on the Egyptian televisions and some foreign televisions, and he promised that the relations between Egypt and Iran might be back, and he said many things promising. And after that, there was some inside tensions between, the Salafi tendency people who organized some protests in front of his house in Cairo. And I remember some clashes happened between the military police and the protesters who were all coming from a Salafi background. And after that, when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited Iran and he visited Al Hussein Mosque, and he made his famous sign, victory there. So some people took it as, the Shia people are coming back to Iran. And you remember the rising of Salafi people then was something like clashing back with the Iranian promising back relations. So my question here is, do you think that if the revolution were going on the same track with the Muslim Brotherhood and rule, would you expect that the Muslim Brotherhood will go with the relation with doing official relations with Iran? And the second thing is, and the second question is, after the military coup happened in 2013, I think Sisi's regime is standing with Iran on some points. Maybe the first and the clear point here is the anti-revolution alliance, the anti-Arab revolution alliance, and some exports or some trading deals. So I've read a report here that $2,200.8 million was the trading balance between Iran and Egypt. This was in 2019, 2 years ago, and Egypt Egypt was Iran's 200 and the second export destination during the year of 2019. So do you think that this is an indicator of they may have some understandings together, like the Sisi's regime and Iran at the same time? Thank you so much.
Ahmed, before you answer, if I could ask you to keep your questions brief. You've raised a lot of interest, and so there's a lot of questions, and we want to get through as many of them as possible. Thank you.
Sure. So briefly, yes, thank you, Saif. The Salafi movement and the Salafists in 2012-13 had a very, very big anti-Iran rapprochement. And you mentioned this protest by the Iran's interest section head during the time when Egypt signed a deal at the time, the tourism minister, to bring in Iranian tourists. And actually there were 2 planes, if I remember correctly, who that brought Iranian tourists to Luxor and Aswan. And the deal was to only bring charter flights to specific cities. And I think they identified Sharm el-Sheikh and Luxor and Aswan as the the places that they would come, and these will be pre-screened individuals or like citizens of Iran. And at the time, as you mentioned, and just briefly, a lot of Salafi preachers, Mohammed Hassan, Mohammed Hussein Yaqub, and others, I mean, I have videos for them using language that's like, I couldn't understand that this is something that's even possible to use in a mosque and in a sermon against a fellow Muslim, even if you disagree with them. So it was just too much out of control, I think. And it was also representative of what was going on in Egypt. There are so many things out of control anyways. And I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood necessarily, or Ahmed Morsy as a president or others, understood what they have been running and what they are dealing with. Part of it is their weakness, ignorance. Part of it also is other interests from other parts of the state to make them fail. So, I mean, it goes both ways. To your point about Sisi, and I don't want to go into the speculation of what if under the Muslim Brotherhood, just because it was a very short-lived like moment. But I would say that it wasn't going to be as easy as people might think. The Iranians do not necessarily think highly of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, from interviews that I have had of people who were engaging with the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, they were not feeling like this is going to be the right path. But again, these are all speculations that we will never be able to ascertain. On the Sisi front, I think it was clear from the beginning, Sisi came to power and he didn't want to have any issues with anyone. And in the first couple of years, he was looking for funding and money. And the Gulf gave him, like Saudi and the UAE basically gave him the money that kept the system and regime afloat until 2016 when he moved on to the IMF deal. Since then, I think he was very clear, these catchphrases, the Gulf is a red line, the security is a red line, مسافة السكة, so we'll get there in time. All of these things, whether related to the Yemen war, whether it's related to Iranians like again involvement in different capitals and so on. But Egypt was very clear that it's not going to really send troops or engage in any military scrimmage or any of that stuff that possibly the Israelis or the Saudis and the Gulf countries would want with Iran. And I think that was right, rational, smart, and I don't think anyone should engage in that. On the economic piece, and
Ahmed,
maybe
sorry,
that will...
before you continue, Ahmed, so you are saying if Iran gives Sisi the rice that he wanted, it will be fine?
No,
Iranian rice?
I
Do you
don't
have good
think
rice
so.
in Iran, Mehran? If you have a good rice,
Iran has a lot of rice, you know.
Yeah.
No, I think Iran would benefit a lot from a relationship with Egypt for different reasons, politically, of course, and economically. But at the same time, the economic sanctions that the US have is making even the biggest and the strongest European countries unable to have actually a system that they can deal with Iran. So I don't think that Egypt is going to be able to bypass that or deal with that. In any normal circumstances, a country like Iran that produces a lot, I'm not saying it's China, I'm not saying it's a high quality United States manufacturing, but it actually produces a lot. With Egypt will be an export market, like what Turkey is using most of the Arab countries as an export market. And this is not something that we're saying because we're saying Egypt is bad or Iran is great. It's just a statement of the fact. And Egypt could become that country if it thought and went that route, but maybe it doesn't want to do that now. So again, any bilateral relation will be beneficial economically for sure for the Iranians.
Thank you, Ahmed. One of our attendees, Mr. Walid Salem, has been very patiently waiting. So go ahead, Mr. Walid, please.
Greetings, everyone. I'm not sure if you can see and or hear me.
We can hear you, Walid.
We can hear you and see your hand, yes.
Okay, excellent. So greetings, everyone, and Zaki Ahmed, great presentation and very informative. So I have a couple of questions, really conjectures, and I'd like you to comment on. The first is a minor variation on Khalil's question, which is about what explains the inability of Iran and Egypt to have a modicum of normal relations over the past 40 years. Does this have to do with the tumult of 1979, that the moment Iran became more regionally oriented and more outwardly oriented, Egypt was actually becoming more inwardly oriented because of the long 70s of war and instability, and the decade ending in Sadat's assassination, and Mubarak rising to power. And as you know, I think he was overwhelmed by the internal crises that really never gave him a break. And this is on the one hand. On the other hand, the fact that he appeared to have very informal, very warm and informal relations with the leaders of the Gulf. So it's, there are plenty of anecdotes about how he would lean on Sheikh Zayed or Sheikh al-Sabah and say, I need $300 million, or I will have a bread crisis tomorrow. And, they would send him the money. And he was very, he wasn't secretive about this, Mubarak, that is. So it seems like after 1979, these two countries have had mutually unintelligible discourses about the region. Iran more regionally oriented, whereas Egypt is more internally oriented. So you don't have like interface between each's vision for the region, and therefore Egypt was deferring essentially to the security concerns of the Gulf. So comments on this would be excellent. The other question is a minor one. So you may recall in 2013 that one of Morsy's, former President Morsy's advisors, Mohammed Gadallah, he resigned, and he essentially said this was because of the rapprochement from Morsi to Iran. And it seemed like he said Shia Iran, and it seemed like he wanted to cop out and an easy exit. But later on, he reaffirmed this, that he did this just because he didn't like the Egypt getting closer to Shia Iran. Were you surprised by this anti-Shia sentiment among some Egyptian intelligentsia, and or no, or not, or do you think this was just a fluke thing? Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Walid. So I'll answer the last one first, and then we can go back to the first. No, I believe there is anti-Shia sentiments when needed, when it's touching someone directly, or it's affecting their understanding and perception and politics as well. So this anti-Shia sentiment was only used and amplified whenever there is a moment of potential rapprochement with Iran. And we are not 100% sure if this is just happening on its own, organically, by some sheikhs and some leaders of the Salafi movement, or it's pushed by the security. I am inclined to believe it's a security-induced kind of anti-Shiite language, because it serves the purpose of maintaining a certain understanding and a certain power dynamic vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis the Gulf. And I think that the time of Morsi in power was very, very specific, that this was, I think, the most amplified and loud anti-Shiite sentiments that we have seen, that even included the death of some members of the Shiite community by a mob that attacked someone in his house. So we have seen things that are kind of unnecessary to start with, unrealistic when it comes to building a relationship or trying to find a way and a path forward in a relationship with another country. And it also doesn't go with the fact that countries like Saudi Arabia or other Arab Gulf countries that are majority Sunni, or even Wahhabi in terms of the thinking, have political and economic relationships with Iran. So it just goes against this rational thinking of like, how can't I have a relationship with that? If I have a relationship with another country that is not even Muslim country, or does not believe in like a secular country? Why can't I have a relationship with a country that's Muslim? So again, the language here is interesting to look at, and it's maybe a research project of its own to look at the discourse behind that. And I know there are a couple of colleagues who have looked at that, whether it's the media or other moments, especially 2006 when Israel was engaging in a war with Lebanon after and Hezbollah. So that was also another time which we can maybe look at that. On your earlier point about security and the relationship with the Gulf and this personal relationship that Mubarak established with the Gulf sheikhs and leaders and emirs, you're right. I mean, again, it just falls in the personality politics, in the leadership characteristics that Mubarak stood for. And for him, this is what I know, this is what I can do, and that's what I will continue to do. And as long as it's providing what I want and what Egypt can get, then great. We don't need to do more beyond that. And I think also another thing to think about is that Iran is not like Israel in terms of Egypt didn't go to war with Iran. Egypt doesn't have a border with Iran, like what we have as Egypt with Israel, for instance. So this distance as well geographically kind of creates a buffer for Egypt to kind of, use to push away any potential issues that might come, and then just export it and keep it, that the Gulf have to deal with it. If the Gulf are asking Egypt, and I think that was my point earlier, that any movement towards Iran has to come in tandem with the Gulf countries. But I don't think Egypt is necessarily going to lead that on its own. It will be something that the Gulf might, or Egypt might want the Gulf to start, and then Egypt will join and be part of the conversation and maybe convene and push for that. One last thing to remember and always to consider, that despite the rhetoric, we also have to, despite the rhetoric that can be very, very extreme sometimes, especially from some Iranian individuals in power and others, Iran is pragmatic. If Iran has a deal and it has an opportunity and a path and there's some win-win, Iran is willing to talk. And I think Iran has proved that, but the media, certain countries try to amplify only the bad stuff. And I'm not trying to defend any Iranian aggression, so we're clear. I'm not saying that what Iran is doing is right, but Iran is basically advancing its own interests in the ways that it sees fit, that goes against what maybe Egypt or Saudi or Israel think. And the only way to deal with that is to find a common ground to start with to change this narrative.
Ahmed, thank you so very much. You've been so generous with your time and expertise. May I ask one last question from one of our attendees? Thank you. This is the last question, I promise. It's from Mr. Ahmed Abu Zaid. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Professor Mehran. I would like to ask Dr. Ahmed a very quick two questions, if you don't mind. The first one is regarding the state view. To what extent the changing dynamic in regional balance of power since the Arab-Israeli peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979 in one hand, and the Islamic Revolution in 1979, it changed this relationship between the two regional powers. To what extent the regional dynamics affect the relationship between Iran and Egypt since the early 80s until now, and to what extent is Egypt is independent in its foreign relation toward Iran away from the Arab consideration. On the other hand, which is non-state view, if you remember during the Khatami, especially Khatami administration, there was a strong inclination within the Egyptian intellectuals to adopt a pacifist and even cooperative view toward Iran. Like I remember Muhammad Hassanin Hekel, Fahmi Hwedi, Ahmed Kamal Abul Magd, Abdullah Sinnawi, from ultra-right nationalist to ultra-right-wing Islamist. To what extent now this civil society or intellectual effect the outcome or the sum of this relation? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. On the seven, I mean, again, going back to your point about the changes regional dynamics, I think there are moments in specifically between Egypt and Iran that are very key dates. So the 51 to 53 timeframe is very, very key. As I talked earlier, the Mossadegh time, the change in Egypt, and then Mossadegh removed from power. 79 is another moment that completely changes not just the relationship between Egypt and Iran, but actually a complete regional configuration. I think there are 4 events in that year that are very, very big. One starts with the Islamic Revolution, or in Iran in January, February, when Khomeini came back. You have the peace treaty and the signing of it in March of the Camp David Accords from September the year before. You have Saddam Hussein coming to power towards the end of the year in Iraq by removing Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. And you have the Russian invasion to Afghanistan in December of 79. 79 is a year that I think changed a lot of dynamics that we are still dealing with until today, but the players have either shifted from the Soviets to the Americans, from Iran and Egypt to Egypt and Israel, to some of these dynamics. So it will be a different and a long conversation and research project that we can engage in. From that sense, I think security became paramount for Egypt after 79, domestically as well, dealing with Islamists, making sure that, especially after the assassination of Sadat, after other attempts at Mubarak later in the 90s in Sudan, for instance, by the Sudanese in Ethiopia, and these have kind of made the Egyptian regime double down on the focus on security in any relationship with Iran, and maintain very strong and cozy and friendly relations with the Gulf, because they can provide the funds, because they can provide also alliance and space that can help the Egyptian regime vis-a-vis or with the West and in other places. So these were main components for Egypt, and also again the leadership of Mubarak helped with that. His character, again, his way of doing things, and so on and so forth. In terms of the civil society, I think the closest time we have seen any engagement between Egypt and Iran on the intelligentsia side and all of that is the mid-2000s. And specifically after the meeting between Khatami and Mubarak that happened in Switzerland, there have been a lot that started coming out of the Ahram Studies, Ahram Strategic Center, Iranian studies booklets, a lot of conversations, edited volumes, trips back and forth. There were even meetings that were condoned and supported by the security services in Egypt that took place in Egypt for some Iranian guests, and so on and so forth. And I think this was a time that what we can call, this is the group that any nation could use for a track 2 kind of conversation, to kind of build measures of confidence, support, find areas of commonality and build on them. And I think whenever something changed in the region, whenever there is an incident, whenever there is an attack, whenever there is a statement even as silly as a member of parliament, a member of a local council in Iran who says something about Egypt, about Mubarak, about the Gulf, usually Egypt stops everything in its tracks. And this was a good excuse that Mubarak used, and the security services excused, whenever they say, like, look, they didn't change the name of the street. Look, they are saying that Mubarak is a dictator. Look, they are doing this to the Gulf countries. And finding these excuses not to engage has been a tradition that continued until Mubarak was deposed or removed from power. To what extent this can be done, and that's my last point, Mehran, I think if we can't do this now, with the expansion of the Iranians in different countries, whether in good and bad way, then we're not going to be able to. Iran is focused on having a deal with the West. It managed to get that back in 2015. Now the focus is domestic because of the upcoming Iranian elections. And after that elections, I hope that some of the Arab countries, including Egypt, would have a better and a changed approach on how to engage that leadership. Maybe think of how to pacify the region in a way that could be, in a way, in a win-win approach, or start with small incremental steps that can build the measures between both sides. And maybe ending the Yemen war could be a start, but there has to be something that breaks this kind of tension and who bites or who would say sorry first.
Ahmed, you just mentioned a win-win scenario, which is very seldom heard here in the region and in the international relations of the Middle East, which unfortunately is often characterized by zero-sum game. So thank you so very much for ending your brilliant talk on that note. I need to apologize to our audiences because there's still some questions that we didn't get to. And Ahmed, I need to apologize to you. I asked for an hour and took an hour and a half.
My pleasure.
Thank you so very much. I do have one question. When Egypt and Iran do eventually establish relations, will you come back and analyze the relationship at that point for us, hopefully in person?
I would love that. And we can always continue the conversation. And I mean, if anyone have questions, I'm happy to continue offline or in any other setup. But yeah, I enjoy these engagements, and thank you, Mehran, and thank you everyone for giving me the time.
Thank you very much. There are some questions, and thank you for that kind offer, Ahmed. You can be reached through the American Political Science Association, and your contact info is on the APSA site. So thank you again. My thanks to my colleagues who have been working behind the scenes to make this possible, and to our audiences across the world. Thank you very much, and good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.